Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, David. Yes.
Yeah, good. Thanks for showing up nice and early. I can use
Yeah.
that extra time.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. Well, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. So we'll start at 12.
Pardon?
Will we start at 12?
Oh, you're in a
Or
different time
11
zone.
11 your time, right?
Yeah, we could start now if you're ready.
Oh, I'm ready whenever you are.
Yeah. I'm all set up, and
Okay.
I feel like I'm forgetting something, but I don't think so. I've turned on the recorder, and yeah, so I think we can do it. Do you have any questions for me before we get started?
How long do you think you'll be doing these shows? You've got such a library built up.
I know. I don't know. I
Do
don't
you
know.
have a practice, David, or
No, I
are you
used to do for about 10 years. I did it. I had a part-time practice while teaching at the university. And then I got lured into market research, which involved a lot of travel, uh, but opportunity to make more money for a growing family.
Yeah.
Uh,
Wow. Well, I'm glad that we're doing this via Zoom so I get to see you.
yeah,
I
likewise.
because I am so it feels like it's a real exaggeration, but it feels like being skinned alive to give speeches and stuff like that for me, because I'm always so, especially when we're talking about Jungian depth psychology, I'm going to say something that's, you know, controversial or out there or
Uh-huh.
whatever. And so, yeah, so your questions were wonderful. I feel
Good.
really comfortable.
I
So,
really appreciated your feedback too. That was very reinforcing.
oh,
Uh,
good.
yeah, that you.
Yeah, I mean, it was clear you've been doing it for a while. I
Yeah.
actually had one girl that called me last year. She saw our postings on our website, the Friends of Jung in Phoenix, and she asked me to do a podcast with her. And I said, yeah. And it was awful.
Oh,
She wouldn't give me questions ahead of time.
yeah.
She wanted to talk about nonviolence, but never got to it. And her opening question to me was, what makes people want to kill another person?
Oh boy.
And I thought, wow, this isn't going to go anywhere real quick.
Well,
So
I'm glad I did better than that.
I was a
Well,
little nervous.
we should go ahead and get started now. I'm going
Yeah.
to be sending you video clips of the whole thing, a clip that I'll pull out, plus the whole interview on YouTube. And then
Okay.
the podcast itself is audio on my website and distributed in a lot of different places. So all of that will come out on Thursday, just so
Okay.
you know. And
Great.
I'll email that to you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I'll also when I send it to you, there'll also be an invitation to run an ad for your book on the
Okay.
website.
Okay. Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
so um, and it is the internet, so we could get disconnected, and if that happens, we'll just do our best to get
Okay.
connected again and hook up from where we left off. And last night we had a power outage, and that was upsetting. So hopefully that won't
Oh,
happen.
yeah. Now,
Yeah.
will the whole video will our whole Zoom talk be uploaded as well, or just okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
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 Okay. So I'm going to welcome you, and you say some version of thank you, and we'll be off and running. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Renee Cunningham, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for having me. And also thank you for the amazing work that you do in your podcast.
Well,
It's such
thank
a
you.
contribution. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to get that acknowledgement. Makes me feel good. It'll set me up for the whole rest of the day. So we're going to be discussing some of the issues that are raised by your forthcoming book. Your book's not quite out yet, is that right?
Right. And it's my first book.
first book, and
my
it's
first
called
book.
A Jungian Analysis of Archetypal Nonviolence, King and Racism Through the Eyes of Selma. And that's a mouthful.
Yeah, we changed the title. The title is Archetypal Nonviolence, Jung, King, and Culture Through the Eyes of Selma.
So the difference is culture, the word culture instead of racism?
Culture. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Racism is discussed, but it's mostly about, yes, about Selma and archetypal nonviolence.
Right. Okay. Well, before we get into your book, when did you decide you wanted to become a Jungian analyst? You look very young and not the image of a grizzled Jungian analyst.
No leathered wear and tear yet. Well, I will be 62 this year, but I am considered young, I guess.
You look much younger than 62.
Thank you. Yeah, in a couple of months, I'll be 62. But, I'd been in analysis for a bit here in Phoenix. This would have been back in 2003, 2004. 2005, I went to the advanced training program in Santa Fe and actually loved it. Was there for 2 years. And I had a dream that kind of led me into training. And it was quite a powerful dream. In which, in the dream, the sun is coming up behind a mountain that's very close to my house here in Phoenix. And I was under an overpass with a male person of importance in my life who said to me in the dream, "You must return to ISIS." And I understood that as I needed to reconnect with the deep feminine in myself as well as the self. I needed to do that deep work.
Yeah.
And it became a real symbol for my training and the work that I've done. And so that image continues to live in me.
I need to interrupt just a moment here. I noticed that I'm not hearing you through my earbuds. So
Oh,
I've got to figure out the setting to make sure that happens.
let me see if my volume, does it matter whether my volume's up, David?
No, it's just,
Okay.
don't worry about that. Let's see. Because I changed it in the audio settings and I don't know why my that's not showing up as an option here.
Huh.
I live in the world of Macintosh. Let's see here. Sound. Yeah, I guess they conked out for a little while. Say something now.
Welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
That's it. Yeah, good. Okay, so now it's working. And I better make a little note of the time here on something. I'll just find it.
11:57.
Yeah, I'll find it. Okay, so where were we? You were telling me about your dream that you had
Yeah.
and the need to connect to a deeper part of yourself.
Yeah.
How is it that you knew about the Jungian perspective in order to, you said you had been in Jungian therapy, right?
Well, I had been in Jungian therapy actually before I went into analysis here in Phoenix, in my training to become an MFT in
Okay.
California, and
Yeah.
really enjoyed it. And then when I moved here to Phoenix, got into analysis. Yeah.
Okay. And what drew you to it, to the Jungian position?
It's a really, really great question. I'll try to be succinct.
You
But
don't have to be
when you
succinct. We got a lot of time.
okay. When you're in training, right, you learn all the different theories of
Yeah.
psychology. But I think most therapists would agree that people who stay in this business for a while or become therapists often have narcissistic wounding.
Hmm.
And I didn't find that a lot of the schools that I kind of was trained in really dealt with the deeper traumas and
Yeah.
the intuition of the self and the soul that's located in there in the unconscious that needs to be cultivated. And I always had some internal knowing about this idea that drew me to Jungian psychology when I started learning about it.
Uh-huh.
And it actually helped, very much helped me to feel included in a world where I felt marginalized and isolated. In my wishes and understanding of the transpersonal realm of the psyche.
Okay. You sound
Yes.
like the right person to become a Jungian
Yeah.
analyst for
Yes.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, yeah. So, how was that journey for you of, getting to actually become a certified analyst? It involves a lot of work and study, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It was really difficult. I trained through the Interregional Society. And of course, now that we have COVID, one of the gifts of COVID in training is that it's offering candidates a lot of screen time and supervision by phone. And when I started training in 2007, we were really required to travel to wherever we needed to go for either what we call seminar or supervision, even analysis, and what we call the later stages of training, which is control, which is usually like the last 2 to 3 years. So there's nowhere in Phoenix. There are very few analysts here in Phoenix, as a matter of fact. And so I had to travel everywhere. So there were months where I would be gone 2 weekends, sometimes 3 weekends, just trying to get all of my training in.
Hmm.
And I got really tired about halfway through, did not do well on some of my exams, and got very depressed. And I took a leave for a couple of years.
Uh-huh.
And it was probably the best 2 years of my training. Really, really helped to take some time off and
Yeah.
reflect and really be with that existential question of what, do I really want to do this? Because it's exceedingly taxing and
Yeah.
expensive,
Yeah.
which
Right.
the Jungian community is, and I'm not a wealthy individual. So it was quite a sacrifice for everyone in my home. But I think we're trying really to amend that and draw in a more diverse culture, I hope, of therapists who will undergo training. And that's due to some really good work by some of the analysts in the community. So it ended up being for me from 2007 to 2017 before I graduated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is a long uh, and trying process,
Yeah.
journey. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then you write this book about racism, and you were kind of ahead of the curve in a way because
Yeah.
before you were into this before this huge cultural eruption that we've been having with marches and protests and all of that. So
Yeah.
something in you had something happened in your life to sensitize you to that dimension?
Yeah, it's really an incredible personal kind of journey that really started out with pieces of puzzles like complexes do, right? In analysis and various memories that I could not make sense of. And
Mm,
the marches and the upheaval. I wished the book had come out this summer, which is when it was supposed to, but COVID has delayed it. But in any event, I grew up in Alabama in the deep South, probably two
ah,
hours from the Florida borderline, state line, and I it was an amazing childhood that I had, but it was a very violent time in our culture. My father trained as an Army pilot to fly Chinooks in Alabama, and then went on to serve 2 tours in Vietnam. And the first tour was right around the beginning of what became this revolution. And so for me, I grew up in a very small town where African Americans lived on one side of the town, whites lived on the other. The schools were segregated. It made absolutely no sense to me as a child, but you could feel the power-packed, violent eruptions going on underneath the surface at all times, which of course was capped off by a voicelessness, which is part of the complex, right? You're not allowed to talk about it or ask questions. And while my parents talked about racism, or with me and my siblings, there were 5 of us. It still never really answered essential questions for me. And when my father left and went away to war the first time, which was, by the way, the year that Selma happened, I was 6. I remember that I ran away from kindergarten because the teacher accused me of doing something I didn't do. And I decided I would march home at the break and sneak out of the school. And that was sort of the memory that tripped this entire thing. Because it was after that experience, David, that I underwent what I now consider my first childhood depression, and a big split around the loss of my father, the violence of the war, the lack of understanding what was happening, not having a choice about it, and watching my mother raise 5 of us under the age of when she was, under 28 years old.
Wow.
Dad came home, Dad's still alive, but in truth, painfully so, as war does, and violence, it changed our family dramatically.
Did it change him? I mean,
Yes.
often men come back from war and it seems like they're different people because they've been so traumatized by the process, and that in the past has not been at all validated by the culture.
That's right. So it changed my father, and it changed all of us. And it was it took all this time to be able to put voice to just the affective upheaval and the lack of capacity to put words to what was happening. There was no language for it. And of course, in those days, you might every now and then get an image of what was going on in Vietnam. But, we never knew where my father was. We would send cards and letters, but we would never know, would he get them? Did he receive them? Was he even coming home? Was he even alive?
Wow.
And so for 5 of us, we all managed it very differently. And my tendency was to really withdraw and use my mind and my imagination as a way of coping.
Where were you in that order of kids? Were you the oldest, the youngest? Where were you?
I was number 3 of 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
This actually feels like a movie almost as you describe it. I'm sort of seeing a movie here, and maybe you'll have another book in which you'll you'll write it from that standpoint.
Yeah, if I can survive. So, I'm really trying to rest. This book has taken it out of me. And,
I can
in
imagine.
2013, when we had a conference in Birmingham, and I was so thrilled because for the first time in my then 55 years, I made a plan to drive back to my hometown. And so I rented a car, I drove through Selma, I drove through Troy, I got down to the town, which is called Ozark. And by the time I got to Ozark, I had just a huge moment and thought, I have to write about Selma. And I thought, but I'm not, I don't remember Selma. What's going on in Selma? But my visceral memory said, yes, you've got to write about Selma and King. Because when I was little, the reason that King was so important to me all my life is that in the middle of the war, I think I projected onto King the ideal good father that went away.
Oh, wow.
And I would sit in front of the TV and I would watch him. And he made so much sense of what was happening. And he made me feel so much better about what was happening in the world. I had hope. And he held my attention my whole life.
How old were you when you were a kid watching TV during that?
Yeah, Dad went away when I was 6 and was gone almost 18 months. Then he came home for about a year and he went away again, year or two, and then went away again. So I think by the time he had come back for his second tour, I must have been 8 or 9.
And how old were you when the Selma March happened?
I was 6.
6. Wow.
So the Selma marches happened January 18th, which was my birthday, 1965.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So you really felt marked by this.
Yeah.
At
I feel
many
very
levels.
marked. Yeah.
At many
I feel very
levels.
marked by it. Yeah.
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 Wow.
It brings up a lot of feeling. And the synchronicities that I have had in writing this book are absolutely breathtaking.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So that tells us that there was a lot of psychic energy around all of this.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychic energy. So I'll just tell you one synchronicity that was so incredible. The first one was when I got to the hotel down in Alabama and opened my computer to look up Selma. The first thing that came up was that the 50th anniversary would be 6 months from then. So I thought, oh, it's in the air. I'm picking it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then after the book deal was signed, I panicked. I just completely panicked. I thought, I can't do this. This is way too big for me.
Yeah.
You know what? I don't know what I'm doing. And so I panicked and I thought, okay, I'm going to start with King's collected works. There is a set of, let's see, they're called The Papers of Martin Luther King. I have them on my bookshelf. So I tried to find them. I couldn't find them on the internet because I didn't know exactly what they were called. So I located them and they were super expensive. So I thought, well, I'll just order the first one first. And I ordered a used copy. So when the used copy came, David, 3 days later, and I was all aflutter about, I can't do this. This isn't meant for me. I don't want this book kind of thing, but I do want the book. I opened the cover, and on the very first page is a library platelet that says, from the Library of Coretta Scott King, best wishes, Coretta King.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
No
and then I
wonder it was
opened the
expensive.
next.
It was probably, it was
It was
probably
like 40
expensive
bucks.
because of that. It was what?
It was like $40. It was a used book. Whoever sold it did not know what was in it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just finding this to be a fascinating story and how you were drawn into it. I'm wondering if that 2 years that you had to take off from schooling was, where did that come in the writing of the book? Had you started the book yet? Were you overwhelmed yet by the book?
No, I had not. I didn't start writing. I did not even start this until I went back to Alabama and went back in training. But it was the year that I passed all my propedeuticums and was moving into the final phases, which is where you primarily write. And that's when it came through. The whole idea and all of the memories. I went down to Mississippi to the Delta with 2 of my colleagues. We went down to Money, Mississippi. I've just done a tremendous amount of personal reflection around this story. And I think it's important as well to say that when I was in my 20s, I fell in love with an African American man. And that was not received well by particular members on my side of the family. I had a brother who was, this is another thing that very much drew me, which was, why was he different than me? He was a staunch racist. God
Your
rest his soul.
brother, your
My
brother
brother.
was, yeah.
The brother I was, the sibling I was closest to. And, I love my brother. He's no longer with us, but we didn't speak for years. And it was really painful.
Oh, I can
Uh,
imagine.
and I experienced just a taste of what it must be like to have been through not being wanted, not feeling loved, accepted by your community. So that I'm sure was not conscious in writing the book. My relationship with my father was really primarily there, but I can't leave this out because I think I need to honor it as an important part of what brought love back into my life was this man
Yeah.
after
I
more
don't,
traumas. But
yeah, I don't know if you're aware of my background at all, but my mother married a African American man when I was tiny. Uh, so he was the only father that I grew up with, and so I have a whole side of my family that I'm not connected to by blood, but well, actually, I have a half sister who I am connected to by blood, and
yeah,
yeah, so I've had a lot of issues around the racial divide myself. But go ahead, this is not
yeah,
about
and
me; it's about your
yeah.
story.
Well, so you've probably had some of the same dynamics of confusion,
Oh yeah,
curiosity, feelings of unmetabolized, like grief and guilt and shame, and yet absolute humanitarian love for the other, regardless of color. It's not in there, but it gets in there, right?
yeah, yeah,
It becomes part of it. And I certainly, there were all kinds of reasons why it didn't work out. That was, to my mind, not consciously erased, but I'm sure it was in there. If I'm being, a Jungian and honest, uh, but it really didn't work for other very good reasons, which I won't go into. But it did bring up for me and him the real clarity of love, that we love who we love, and we're loving creatures, and but that's not enough sometimes.
yeah. Because you're in this cultural matrix where you're getting all kinds of uh, white water. I'm getting the image of white water going down a raging river, where you're getting all this kind of
Yeah.
input that's very confusing in our
Yeah. And
culture.
see, I left Alabama in adolescence. So we moved away when I was 12.
Okay.
And I was raised primarily in the South, Tennessee, Kentucky. But then I differentiated from my family by moving to California, which was where I spent most of my adult years, and then Arizona. So I met him in California. And of course, I think about this a lot, the pull of the collective, the pull of the cultural complex.
Yeah.
And what happens when shadow doesn't get integrated? When self-reflection or just personal reflection moves out of your life and is replaced by so much shadow that you're willing to sell out everything for a position you're not fully conscious of, which is what happened in the Selma story, right? So much of it is the cultural complex intersecting with personal complexes and values and beliefs, being invested in what James Baldwin so aptly said is kin, blood, and home. that you cannot see. You're a blind man. You can't really see what you're investing in. And it's a fascinating piece that I am still intrigued by. I think all of America is intrigued by this notion now. What is that in us that gives it away? We give away our soul instead of reflecting and sitting with the suffering and the pain
Yeah.
to become
Yeah.
a more full human being.
Yes. Now, your book starts out with a chronology about Selma and the march and all of that. And it's actually quite a long, detailed chronology, too long to go through here. But maybe you could hit some of the high points or low points in that chronology here. Would that be possible?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you're giving me the opportunity to do that, because alchemically, it's really interesting to follow and track what happened during Selma. Now, Selma happened right on the heels of King. He went into Montgomery, and then I believe there was about a 6-year break. But he then joins in 63, I want to say, the Million Man March, which is another interesting parallel here with the women's movement, because the Million Man March follows the real firestorm of the Till murders, which happens 10 years to the day of the Million Man March in Washington in 63, I believe. It's August 28th. And so ushering in that, right, you get the passing then of the Civil Rights Act the following year in 64. King then gets the Nobel Peace Prize in, I believe, October or December of 64. He gets invited into Selma in December of 64, and he conducts his first march in January, on January 18th, 65. Now, with every consecutive march, it's really interesting to watch. What happens is most of the people in Selma would not participate in the march. They had way too much invested. They were all afraid to really dig in. And his lieutenants, who, by the way, I could spend another whole book writing about, that were just incredible, were trying to engage people in the marches, and they were afraid. Until, I want to say it was Bevel. Is it Bevel?
White people or black people or both?
Black
I'm
people,
afraid.
but both.
Okay.
But Black people were so invested in their jobs that the jobs they had, they didn't want to lose them. And of
Right.
course, the sheriff and the public safety director, James Baker and Clark, were they knew who was getting involved in these marches. They watched it really closely. But what you see that starts to happen over time is that as the news media captures these images, right, which really works as sort of this lens of consciousness for the country, and the news begins to spread, people start coming in from the edges and joining in. And the very first march that really transforms Selma and brings in the Selma folks is the Teachers' March. And the teachers and the students get involved, and it's a big success. And that, from that moment on, what you see start happening is little fires start spreading, sparking all over Alabama, out into the different regions of the South, and all across the country, very similar to this summer. And so until you have two big flashpoints, and that's the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson and Reverend James Reeb, who really make the story change in a pivotal way. It is as if we thought about it alchemically, and we're watching it from above, it is as if the self, the archetypal self, is emerging from up underneath a location of the wound of slavery, racism in the deep South, in that red clay. It's as if it just scoops it up and begins to swirl, and it's led by this magnificent group of people. And this very hermetic man, Martin Luther King, who has the capacity, which is why he was, I think, a very special individual. He has the hermetic capacity to hold the tension of violent forces while a new image comes up through nonviolence of the way down the road. And so it is the transcendent, Jung's idea of the transcendent function in motion here, moving between the two halves of the split, coming together in a march. And with each encounter, there is what we call a coagulatio, a separatio, and in that space where they come together is some form of conjunctio, where some element of the divine gets transferred to the souls of the people around, and then by virtue of the lens of the camera begins to integrate shadow in the collective, where people begin to reflect on slavery and racism. And you get a complete movement forward in psychic development, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. It amazes me how there was this deep split, that is with us still today. And for a lot of white people, it comes as a shock, as a surprise, what is all of this about? But because of the way that it's emerged with such clarity now, that there's a growing recognition, particularly, I think, maybe among young white people, of who've joined in on the marches and the protests and so on, that something's got to change.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was a scholarship student at the University of Pennsylvania as an undergraduate, and one of my white friends was from the South, and he invited me to go down home with him for, maybe it was Christmas vacation, Rock Hill, North Carolina. I can't remember if it was North Carolina, South Carolina. And I was in the car. I started to get sick. I remember laying just feeling sick with fear, because I'd grown up in the Black community. And so I had picked up that fear, that the idea of going to the South felt like a huge major risk on my part. I was, I was afraid that something horrible was going to happen to me. And,
Well, you can feel it.
and it
It's
felt
in
like
the air.
the journey into darkness.
Yes.
Now, I actually had a fine time. Nothing bad happened, but I really felt the oppression of that archetypal aspect of what the South represents to.
Yeah. You can feel the cultural complex. You can feel it in your body.
Yeah.
It's a really visceral, and I don't know unless you get out of it and go back that you can really feel it. I'm curious about that, right? So it's a bit like when you're in the complex, you can't see. But when you can get away from the edges of it and gain some consciousness, it shifts you. And that has to affect the body, right? On some level.
Yeah. Now, you referred to Martin Luther King as a hermetic figure, and some people may stick through this interview long enough to hear some of these terms that you were using. In what do you mean when you say he was a hermetic figure?
Well, I don't know that I don't know how he felt about what he did, but I think what was great about King, first and foremost, is that he was an incredible minister and orator. He gave something like over 300 speeches a year in his life.
Wow.
Once he started this, he had incredible libido, but he had markings from a very young age that something big was coming. If you read his life. But when I say hermetic, Mercurius or Hermes has the capacity, and I'm speaking about this spiritually and archetypally in the processes of transformation. To be able to put your foot in two worlds at one time and hold it in a nonviolent way, refusing to tip into the power paradigm, meaning refusing to relate through power as opposed to love and relationship. He could hold the tension of both sides and wait until something changed. And this is what I call in the book the philosophical end of nonviolence. It's a spectrum. On one end, you have tactical nonviolence. On the other side is archetypal, more philosophical, where it is around holding these incredible polar opposites. This is what we do in analysis, right? We, as the analysts, we're holding with the patient the shadow and what the ego is doing and what the self is constellating in the room. And it's our job to try and not intervene with that as much as possible, but to hold that tension of their conscious world, watching the unconscious and what wants to come up that is new in life, and stay with it until they make an awareness through shadow and mirroring. They make an awareness, or they have an awareness of, oh my God, that's me. I do that. I do that to other people. That's a projection. And then there's this moment where you can see the awareness. And so King collectively was really masterful. First and foremost, his social gospel, what he called his social gospel ministry, was really powerful because he dove into Christianity with nonviolence, utilizing nonviolence, and it appealed to everyone. And this made him masterful in political negotiations, social activism, getting things done in the South, building forces, and on both sides, allies as well as, of course, he had his enemies as well. But it made him a real community building, bridge building individual. And the hard work for him, I would guess, was this capacity to stand on both sides of something that his ancestry, it was part of his wound, his core wound, and to still negotiate, to differ and not agree with someone, but to choose relatedness instead of power and control is really the key to nonviolence, and it's what he did very well.
Now, you also talk about King and Gandhi, and who was the third person?
Jung.
Oh, yes. Yes, right. So, yeah, tell us about that linkage that you see between those three figures.
Well, when I first started doing this work on this book, I was really captivated by King, and so I really stuck with his story. But he was so captivated, of course, by Gandhi, and I'm so captivated by Jung as well, that I started exploring, well, how do they all relate to each other as kind of this lineage of these nonviolent teachers, And it was really fascinating because as I studied Gandhi, what really emerged for me with him was his two tenets of satyagraha and ahimsa, which of course became for King two very important concepts. Satyagraha.
Okay. Tell us about those.
So satyagraha, of course, Gandhi was a Hindu, and Sanskrit for satyagraha means truth force. It means to seek the truth. I call this consciousness in analytic work. It's the seeking of a conscious life. And then there's ahimsa, which is the opposite of himsa. Himsa means to harm. Ahimsa means no harm. And Gandhi also called this love force. So satyagraha is truth force. Ahimsa is love force. Truth force may lead you to very rocky roads in relationships, but love force will allow you to hold both. So he dedicated his life to those two. King immersed his work in those two concepts and his 6 principles that he writes about in his book, Stride Towards Freedom. Now, Gandhi's work was capitalized on by Erik Erikson, the psychologist who wrote a book on the psychodynamics of nonviolence in Gandhi. And he felt that a lot of Gandhi's work had to do with his father's passing and his relationship with his mother. King, I believe his work was deeply rooted in not just Gandhi's work, but his own father complex, excuse me. Because his father, his grandfather, he had a whole lineage that were ministers. And they were also early activists in the South. They were behemoths in terms of social change in the South for African Americans. And so King picks this up through his father complex, but he hooks nonviolence up to its original source. Well, maybe it wasn't its original source, but he hooks it up to Christianity. And of course, nonviolence is all through the Bible. And he makes this what he ends up calling social gospel ministry, which is the act of not just going to church, but it's the act of changing your community for the greater good. And that means going out into the community and doing activism. Now, where Jung comes in so uniquely here is that Gandhi and King's work I resonate with in terms of shadow integration. And shadow integration is really a deep reflection of one's behavior and a working on your inner life to such a degree that you begin to see how you participate in conflict or how you participate in relationships in destructive ways. It's essentially called, I'm going to take that projection back by owning my part of the problem. Now, Jung takes this a step further. Jung says, shadow integration is an important part of one's becoming whole, but the essence of the path for Jung was the surrender of the ego to the self, to something greater and divine that lives within me, within you, within the collective, and comes out and up and beyond the cosmos.
Okay.
And that's the final stage of individuation. But so all 3 of them are contributing, which is why I feel nonviolence is archetypal, that it is a lifelong journey of work around becoming a loving, whole human being who also embraces, by the way, aggression, owns it, looks at it, experiences it, works through it, understands it within oneself. So I'll be working on this for the rest of my life, thankfully. And that's kind of in a nutshell how the book really takes form and opens up.
Yeah, I had not, somehow the concept of violence as an archetype that seems to have always been with us, and we have difficulty getting away from it despite the things that we profess and so on. It's still with us, and at times seems more horrible than it ever was before. But also, if there's a continuity there, that maybe it's no worse than it ever was before, but it's just been with us always. So it's easy to go down that path for me. I had never thought to think about nonviolence as archetypal, as coexisting, as both as a social force and as an internal archetypal force.
So, do you remember?
Are you the first person to come up to articulate nonviolence as an archetype? Is that your own personal?
As far as I know, I'm the only one that's written about it archetypally.
Oh, that's big.
Yeah. And there are people that disagree that it's archetypal. But I think it's very archetypal. Remember when they had the Kavanaugh hearings, David? And there was a moment in the Kavanaugh hearings where, what's the senator's name from Arizona? I can't remember. He was the only one he was a Republican guy that, oh God, I know his name. I'm just blanking. Jeff, I think it was a Jeff, somebody. Anyway, he gets in the elevator to break from the Kavanaugh hearings, and one of the women that is so against Kavanaugh puts her foot in the elevator door and says, why are you doing this? You should not be voting for him. Why don't you stand up? And I thought that's a brilliant image of what nonviolence is. And of course the door was symbolic too,
Yeah.
Jan stood in it. And so it happens, it happens at the flip of a switch sometimes. Other times it's very conscious. It's a very tenuous, conscious position of watching and examining and reflecting.
Yeah. Yeah. All of this that we're talking about must in some ways relate to COVID as well.
Yeah.
How would you see that?
Well, I think that COVID is an embodiment, if you will, of our diseased world. Mm-hmm. That our disease of narcissism and hubris and hatred and aggression, the split in our country and our world, has moved into the body, which is what we often find in trauma, that when someone doesn't deal with something, it goes into body and symptomology. So I think COVID became, and of course, COVID is a mandala. It's a shape of a mandala, a dark mandala. I want to give that shout out to Lionel Corbett, who gave me that insight. But I thought it was a brilliant insight. And it was like, yeah, you know what? It is. And it's an embodiment of all of our dis-ease that I think wants to bring us into consciousness together with the political disease. It's unifying us in a strange way, although we have all these people now that don't want to wear masks. So it's a really interesting phenomenon that's happening. And I think the nonviolent outbreaks are a demand to face our narcissism and hubris, to face what we have brought to bear here in our, not just our political zeitgeist, but in our human way of dealing with each other, which is very estranged right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that there are all these multiple cleavages right at the same time.
Right at the same time.
There's this huge political cleavage. There's the environmental cleavage. There's the racial cleavage.
Yeah. So it is like an upheaval from the self.
Yeah, they're not unrelated somehow, right?
Right.
I mean, you've used the word hubris several times, and there's maybe a kind of hubris underlying all of those.
All of them. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the eating of animals that don't belong to us, that come from the woods and the very nature that feeds us, right, is really symbolic of the release of this disease, which is symbolic of our diseased relationship with nature itself. And then on the other side, you've got all of the global warming happening, and the fires and the floods and the mudslides. It's all really, it is the self on steroids, and it's going to get worse. And I think our next Selma really is global warming.
Yeah. I'm not sure where to go from there. There's a lot here to digest. Yeah. Is there anything more about your book that there were a couple of quotes in the book that I pulled out. I see one right now in my notes. one of the interesting chapters that you have in your book is why we march. I thought that's a very interesting question, and is there some deeper thing about marching, about the act of marching? And you wrote, a march is significant as an initiatory experience in cultural development. That's just one sentence, but that kind of packs a lot into that one sentence there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I went to the Women's March in Washington in 2017, and I have to say it was a life-changing experience. I really understood for the first time the archetypal experience of democracy and being an American. And it was deeply moving. So if we look all the way back to the Bible, David, right, we have the Exodus and, the search for the homeland for the Jews. And this is what happens with marches. People are in usually a spiritual state or a soulful state of exile. They don't feel that they have a home. We haven't felt that America was really home for a while in this split that's been rocking back and forth. And so when the unconscious is in upheaval and things are changing, like-minded individuals tend to gather together. And numbers, when an individual starts a movement with numbers, you really just get psychic libido going crazy. And in Washington, it felt very serpentinian. The marches moved in and out of the streets and people singing and chanting and marching. It felt very shamanic.
Yeah.
In the sense that it was some form of movement from exile to home. And it begins with the search for a new place. And of course, we had leading up to the Women's March, the new administration, in which, as we all know now, very oppressive and very regime-like. And that was a knock on the door for this is changing now. I mean, we have this administration to give a lot of thanks to, because
They've woken us
he did
up in some ways.
he did his job, really. He shamanically did his job. He brought to Washington like, I think it was over 1 million women and men and children in like in the space of like a month. And that march has led to all of the movements that we've seen since. And then this movement of the administration out, but hopefully on the exit is a huge waking up for what I feel in my bones may be a new humanitarian epoch that we're on the edge of.
I hope so.
I hope so too. I
Yeah.
could be wrong, but
You know, the people that I hang out with, are sort of in the camp of therapists and liberals and people like that. And so I see lots of good examples of what the underlying nonviolent archetype is capable of, like all the wonderful things, all the wonderful art and musical expressions that people have done of coming together in community in response to COVID, and reaching out to one another and creating, and just some wonderful things that show our angelic side, if you will. Right now, I think we're in the minority, so so one hopes that there's some moral force in our march that will, tip the system a bit for the planet to have a longer life.
Yeah.
I found one of the other quotes that I pulled out of your book. You write, racism is a shared wound in our American narrative, which is not going away. Each of us playing a part in the master-slave archetypal relationship system. And I think a number of Black authors have written about the that relationship of master and slave, and it not being altogether clear who's on top and who's on
Who's
the
on
bottom.
top? Really great point. Yeah. Well, the whole book, and I wanted to be very careful about using those terms because I've never been a slave. I hope I never am. There was no disrespect there in that. What I used it for was what I mean to express, and that is emotional, spiritual, right? Bondage of ourselves inside of ourselves. So I think that the master slave archetypal relationship is actually our first humanitarian split from when we first it's the story of Adam and Eve, right? The choice of love versus curiosity for knowledge, and the cultivation of consciousness, which has its dark side too. But that fundamentally, in psychic development, there is always a split. And you get these two sides that go at war with each other over power versus love, dominance versus repression. And this becomes, over the course of one's life, different characters, different people, different situations.
Yeah, yeah.
But ultimately, it is that struggle for, if you, for a conscious life, a whole life. If you look at the story of Selma, for instance, the two sides of the split come together in moments in time where something unconscious changes, and we only know in the end that something has moved by all of the spread of the marches. But essentially, what I say in the book is the African American contains parts of the master inside of themselves that they need to have access to be whole. The white man contains inside of himself the slave, which they split off from and deny and compensate for it through hubris and aggression. If there could be a way of getting in touch with each of those sides in a positive way, then the slave would be allowed to develop in light of the master's help, and the master through appropriate should I say appropriate humiliation or dissolution of persona and ego through humility, learn how to be much more human and kind and empathic.
Yeah, and you're making me think of the yin yang symbol, in which you've got the black and the white, and it's kind of a moving thing of the one is moving into transforming into its opposite, and also the seed of the opposite is so the white
That's
side
right.
has a little black seed, and the black side has a little white seed.
Yeah.
So that's a graphically expressed deep wisdom that's been with us for a long time, and we're seeing it
Long
acted out in
time.
this way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Renee, I really want to thank you for sharing your struggle with us, and the growth in your life that's come out of that, and the inspiration to the rest of us to wrestle with our inner darkness and our inner light. And
Yeah.
so thanks for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, and thank you for allowing me to spend time with you. And, for anybody who reads the book, I hope that they can just come away with just one small thing, if anything, that they can really hang on to.
I
It's
think
a
that,
very
yeah,
important story in our American narrative.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really, as I say, I think you were prescient in being pulled into writing this story just before it all hit the fan, so
Yeah.
to speak.
Yeah. Very
Okay.
true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate
Okay.
it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to let that go.